About the end of the year 1639, a troop of horsemen arrived, towards midday, in a little village at the northern extremity of the province of Auvergne, from the direction of Paris. The country folk assembled at the noise, and found it to proceed from the provost of the mounted police and his men. The heat was excessive, the horses were bathed in sweat, the horsemen covered with dust, and the party seemed on its return from an important expedition. A man left the escort, and asked an old woman who was spinning at her door if there was not an inn in the place. The woman and her children showed him a bush hanging over a door at the end of the only street in the village, and the escort recommenced its march at a walk. There was noticed, among the mounted men, a young man of distinguished appearance and richly dressed, who appeared to be a prisoner. This discovery redoubled the curiosity of the villagers, who followed the cavalcade as far as the door of the wine shop. The host came out, cap in hand, and the provost inquired of him with a swaggering air if his pothouse was large enough to accommodate his troop, men and horses. The host replied that he had the best wine in the country to give to the king's servants, and that it would be easy to collect in the neighborhood litter and forage enough for their horses. The provost listened contemptuously to these fine promises, gave the necessary orders as to what was to be done, and slid off his horse, uttering an oath proceeding from heat and fatigue. The horsemen clustered round the young man, one held his stirrup, and the provost deferentially gave way to him to enter the inn first. No more doubt could be entertained that he was a prisoner of importance, and all kinds of conjectures were made. The men maintained that he must be charged with a great crime, otherwise a young nobleman of his rank would never have been arrested. The women argued, on the contrary, that it was impossible for such a pretty youth not to be innocent. Inside the inn all was bustle, the serving lads ran from cellar to garret, the host swore and dispatched his servant girls to the neighbors, and the hostess scolded her daughter, flattening her nose against the panes of a downstairs window to admire the handsome youth. There were 2 tables in the principal eating room. The provost took possession of one, leaving the other to the soldiers, who went in turn to tether their horses under a shed in the backyard. Then he pointed to a stool for the prisoner, and seated himself opposite to him, rapping the table with his thick cane. "Alf," he cried, with a fresh groan of weariness, "I heartily beg your pardon, Marquis, for the bad wine I am giving you." The young man smiled gaily. "The wine is all very well, Monsieur Provost," said he, "but I cannot conceal from you that however agreeable your company is to me, this halt is very inconvenient. I am in a hurry to get through my ridiculous situation, and I should have liked to arrive in time to stop this affair at once." The girl of the house was standing before the table with a pewter pot which she had just brought, and at these words she raised her eyes on the prisoner, with a reassured look which seemed to say, "I was sure that he was innocent." "But," continued the Marquis, carrying the glass to his lips, "this wine is not so bad as you say, Monsieur Provost." Then turning to the girl, who was eyeing his gloves and his ruff. "To your health, pretty child." "Then," said the provost, amazed at this free and easy air, "perhaps I shall have to beg you to excuse your sleeping quarters." "What," exclaimed the Marquis, "do we sleep here?" "My lord," said the provost, "we have 16 long leagues to make, our horses are done up, and so far as I am concerned I declare that I am no better than my horse." The Marquis knocked on the table, and gave every indication of being greatly annoyed. The provost meanwhile puffed and blowed, stretched out his big boots, and mopped his forehead with his handkerchief. He was a portly man, with a puffy face, whom fatigue rendered singularly uncomfortable. "Marquis," said he, "although your company, which affords me the opportunity of showing you some attention, is very precious to me, you cannot doubt that I had much rather enjoy it on another footing. If it be within your power, as you say, to release yourself from the hands of justice, the sooner you do so the better I shall be pleased. But I beg you to consider the state we are in. For my part, I am unfit to keep the saddle another hour, and are you not yourself knocked up by this forced march in the great heat?" "True, so I am," said the Marquis, letting his arms fall by his side. Well, then, let us rest here, sup here, if we can, and we will start quite fit in the cool of the morning. Agreed, replied the Marquis, but then let us pass the time in a becoming manner. I have 2 pistoles left, let them be given to these good fellows to drink. It is only fair that I should treat them, seeing that I am the cause of giving them so much trouble. He threw 2 pieces of money on the table of the soldiers, who cried in chorus, Long live the Marquis. The provost rose, went to post sentinels, and then repaired to the kitchen, where he ordered the best supper that could be got. The men pulled out dice and began to drink and play. The Marquis hummed an air in the middle of the room, twirled his mustache, turning on his heel and looking cautiously around, then he gently drew a purse from his trousers pocket, and as the daughter of the house was coming and going, he threw his arms round her neck as if to kiss her, and whispered, slipping 10 louis into her hand. The key of the front door in my room, and a quart of liquor to the sentinels, and you saved my life. The girl went backwards nearly to the door, and returning with an expressive look, made an affirmative sign with her hand. The provost returned, and 2 hours later supper was served. He ate and drank like a man more at home at table than in the saddle. The Marquis plied him with bumpers, and sleepiness, added to the fumes of a very heady wine, caused him to repeat over and over again, Confound it all, Marquis, I can't believe you are such a blackguard as they say you are, you seem to me a jolly good sort. The Marquis thought he was ready to fall under the table, and was beginning to open negotiations with the daughter of the house, when, to his great disappointment, bedtime having come, the provoking provost called his sergeant, gave him instructions in an undertone, and announced that he should have the honor of conducting the Marquis to bed, and that he should not go to bed himself before performing this duty. In fact, he posted 3 of his men, with torches, escorted the prisoner to his room, and left him with many profound bows. The Marquis threw himself on his bed without pulling off his boots, listening to a clock which struck 9. He heard the men come and go in the stables and in the yard. An hour later, everybody being tired, all was perfectly still. The prisoner then rose softly, and felt about on tiptoe on the chimney-piece, on the furniture, and even in his clothes, for the key which he hoped to find. He could not find it. He could not be mistaken, nevertheless, in the tender interest of the young girl, and he could not believe that she was deceiving him. The Marquis's room had a window which opened upon the street, and a door which gave access to a shabby gallery which did duty for a balcony, whence a staircase ascended to the principal rooms of the house. This gallery hung over the courtyard, being as high above it as the window was from the street. The Marquis had only to jump over one side or the other. He hesitated for some time, and just as he was deciding to leap into the street, at the risk of breaking his neck, 2 taps were struck on the door. He jumped for joy, saying to himself as he opened, I am saved. A kind of shadow glided into the room, the young girl trembled from head to foot, and could not say a word. The Marquis reassured her with all sorts of caresses. Ah, sir, said she, I am dead if we are surprised. Yes, said the Marquis, but your fortune is made if you get me out of here. God is my witness that I would with all my soul, but I have such a bad piece of news. She stopped, suffocated with varying emotions. The poor girl had come barefooted, for fear of making a noise, and appeared to be shivering. What is the matter? Impatiently asked the Marquis. Before going to bed, she continued, the provost has required from my father all the keys of the house, and has made him take a great oath that there are no more. My father has given him all, besides, there is a sentinel at every door, but they are very tired, I have heard them muttering and grumbling, and I have given them more wine than you told me. They will sleep, said the Marquis, nowise discouraged, and they have already shown great respect to my rank in not nailing me up in this room. There is a small kitchen garden, continued the girl, on the side of the fields, fenced in only by a loose hurdle, but where is my horse? no doubt in the shed with the rest. I will jump into the yard. You will be killed. So much the better. Ah, Monsieur Marquis, what have you done? Said the young girl with grief. Some foolish things. Nothing worth mentioning, but my head and my honor are at stake. Let us lose no time, I have made up my mind. Stay, replied the girl, grasping his arm. At the left-hand corner of the yard there is a large heap of straw. The gallery hangs just over it. Bravo! I shall make less noise, and do myself less mischief. He made a step towards the door. The girl, hardly knowing what she was doing, tried to detain him, but he got loose from her and opened it. The moon was shining brightly into the yard. He heard no sound. He proceeded to the end of the wooden rail, and perceived the dung heap, which rose to a good height. The girl made the sign of the cross. The Marquis listened once again, heard nothing, and mounted the rail. He was about to jump down, when by wonderful luck he heard murmurings from a deep voice. This proceeded from one of two horsemen, who were recommencing their conversation and passing between them a pint of wine. The Marquis crept back to his door, holding his breath. The girl was awaiting him on the threshold. I told you it was not yet time, said she. Have you never a knife, said the Marquis, to cut those rascals' throats with? Wait, I entreat you, 1 hour only, murmured the young girl. In an hour they will all be asleep. The girl's voice was so sweet, the arms which she stretched towards him were full of such gentle entreaty, that the Marquis waited, and at the end of an hour it was the young girl's turn to tell him to start. The Marquis for the last time pressed with his mouth those lips but lately so innocent, then he half opened the door, and heard nothing this time but dogs barking far away in an otherwise silent country. He leaned over the balustrade, and saw, very plainly, a soldier lying prone on the straw. If they were to awake, murmured the young girl in accents of anguish. They will not take me alive, be assured, said the Marquis. Adieu, then, replied she, sobbing, may heaven preserve you. He bestrode the balustrade, spread himself out upon it, and fell heavily on the dung heap. The young girl saw him run to the shed, hastily detach a horse, pass behind the stable wall, spur his horse in both flanks, tear across the kitchen garden, drive his horse against the hurdle, knock it down, clear it, and reach the highroad across the fields. The poor girl remained at the end of the gallery, fixing her eyes on the sleeping sentry, and ready to disappear at the slightest movement. The noise made by spurs on the pavement and by the horse at the end of the courtyard had half awakened him. He rose, and suspecting some surprise, ran to the shed. His horse was no longer there. The Marquis, in his haste to escape, had taken the first which came to hand, and this was the soldier's. Then the soldier gave the alarm. His comrades woke up. They ran to the prisoner's room, and found it empty. The provost came from his bed in a dazed condition. The prisoner had escaped. Then the young girl, pretending to have been roused by the noise, hindered the preparations by mislaying the saddlery, impeding the horsemen instead of helping them. Nevertheless, after a quarter of an hour, all the party were galloping along the road. The provost swore like a pagan. The best horses led the way, and the sentinel, who rode the Marquis, and who had a greater interest in catching the prisoner, far outstripped his companions. He was followed by the sergeant, equally well mounted, and as the broken fence showed the line he had taken, after some minutes they were in view of him, but at a great distance. However, the Marquis was losing ground. The horse he had taken was the worst in the troop, and he had pressed it as hard as it could go. Turning in the saddle, he saw the soldiers half a musket shot off. He urged his horse more and more, tearing his sides with his spurs, but shortly the beast, completely winded, foundered. The Marquis rolled with it in the dust, but when rolling over he caught hold of the holsters, which he found to contain pistols. He lay flat by the side of the horse, as if he had fainted, with a pistol at full cock in his hand. The sentinel, mounted on a valuable horse, and more than 200 yards ahead of his Seraphile, came up to him. In a moment the Marquis, jumping up before he had tune to resist him, shot him through the head. The horseman fell. The Marquis jumped up in his place without even setting foot in the stirrup, started off at a gallop, and went away like the wind, leaving 50 yards behind him the non-commissioned officer, dumbfounded with what had just passed before his eyes. The main body of the escort galloped up, thinking that he was taken, and the provost shouted till he was hoarse, "Do not kill him." But they found only the sergeant, trying to restore life to his man, whose skull was shattered, and who lay dead on the spot. As for the Marquis, he was out of sight, for, fearing a fresh pursuit, he had plunged into the crossroads, along which he rode a good hour longer at full gallop. When he felt pretty sure of having shaken the police off his track, and that their bad horses could not overtake him, he determined to slacken to recruit his horse. He was walking him along a hollow lane, when he saw a peasant approaching. He asked him the road to the Bourbonnais, and flung him a crown. The man took the crown and pointed out the road, but he seemed hardly to know what he was saying, and stared at the Marquis in a strange manner. The Marquis shouted to him to get out of the way, but the peasant remained planted on the roadside without stirring an inch. The Marquis advanced with threatening looks, and asked how he dared to stare at him like that. "The reason is," said the peasant, "that you have," and he pointed to his shoulder and his ruff. The Marquis glanced at his dress, and saw that his coat was dabbled in blood, which, added to the disorder of his clothes and the dust with which he was covered, gave him a most suspicious aspect. "I know," said he. "I and my servant have been separated in a scuffle with some drunken Germans. It's only a tipsy spree, and whether I have got scratched, or whether in collaring one of these fellows I have drawn some of his blood, it all arises from the row. I don't think I am hurt a bit." So saying, he pretended to feel all over his body. "All the same," he continued, "I should not be sorry to have a wash. Besides, I am dying with thirst and heat, and my horse is in no better case. Do you know where I can rest and refresh myself?" The peasant offered to guide him to his own house, only a few yards off. His wife and children, who were working, respectfully stood aside, and went to collect what was wanted: wine, water, fruit, and a large piece of black bread. The Marquis sponged his coat, drank a glass of wine, and called the people of the house, whom he questioned in an indifferent manner. He once more informed himself of the different roads leading into the Bourbonnais province, where he was going to visit a relative, of the villages, crossroads, distances, and finally he spoke of the country, the harvest, and asked what news there was. The peasant replied, with regard to this, that it was surprising to hear of disturbances on the highway at this moment, when it was patrolled by detachments of mounted police, who had just made an important capture. "Who is that?" asked the Marquis. "Oh," said the peasant, "a nobleman who has done a lot of mischief in the country." "What? A nobleman in the hands of justice?" "Just so, and he stands a good chance of losing his head." "Do they say what he has done?" "Shocking things, horrid things, everything he shouldn't do. All the province is exasperated with him." "Do you know him?" "No, but we all have his description." As this news was not encouraging, the Marquis, after a few more questions, saw to his horse, patted him, threw some more money to the peasant, and disappeared in the direction pointed out. The provost proceeded half a league farther along the road, but coming to the conclusion that pursuit was useless, he sent one of his men to headquarters, to warn all the points of exit from the province, and himself returned with his troop to the place whence he had started in the morning. The Marquis had relatives in the neighborhood, and it was quite possible that he might seek shelter with some of them. All the village ran to meet the horsemen, who were obliged to confess that they had been duped by the handsome prisoner. Different views were expressed on the event, which gave rise to much talking. The provost entered the inn, banging his fist on the furniture, and blaming everybody for the misfortune which had happened to him. The daughter of the house, at first a prey to the most grievous anxiety, had great difficulty in concealing her joy. The provost spread his papers over the table, as if to nurse his ill temper. "The biggest rascal in the world," he cried. "I ought to have suspected him." "What a handsome man he was," said the hostess. "A consummate rascal. Do you know who he is? He is the Marquis de Saint Maxent." "The Marquis de Saint Maxent," all cried with horror. "Yes, the very man," replied the provost, "the Marquis de Saint Maxent, accused, and indeed convicted, of coining and magic." "Ah! Convicted of incest. Oh my God! Convicted of having strangled his wife to marry another, whose husband he had first stabbed. Heaven help us!" All crossed themselves. "Yes, good people," continued the furious provost, "this is the nice boy who has just escaped the king's justice." The host's daughter left the room, for she felt she was going to faint. "But," said the host, "is there no hope of catching him again?" "Not the slightest, if he has taken the road to the Bourbonnais, for I believe there are in that province noblemen belonging to his family who will not allow him to be rearrested." The fugitive was, indeed, no other than the Marquis de Saint Maxent, accused of all the enormous crimes detailed by the provost, who by his audacious flight opened for himself an active part in the strange story which it remains to relate. It came to pass, a fortnight after these events, that a mounted gentleman rang at the wicket gate of the Château de Saint Geran, at the gates of Moulins. It was late, and the servants were in no hurry to open. The stranger again pulled the bell in a masterful manner, and at length perceived a man running from the bottom of the avenue. The servant peered through the wicket, and making out in the twilight a very ill-appointed traveller, with a crushed hat, dusty clothes, and no sword, asked him what he wanted, receiving a blunt reply that the stranger wished to see the Count de Saint Geran without any further loss of time. The servant replied that this was impossible. The other got into a passion. "Who are you?" asked the man in livery. "You are a very ceremonious fellow," cried the horseman. "Go and tell M. de Saint Geran that his relative, the Marquis de Saint Maxent, wishes to see him at once." The servant made humble apologies, and opened the wicket gate. He then walked before the Marquis, called other servants, who came to help him to dismount, and ran to give his name in the Count's apartments. The latter was about to sit down to supper when his relative was announced. He immediately went to receive the Marquis, embraced him again, and gave him the most friendly and gracious reception possible. He wished then to take him into the dining room to present him to all the family, but the Marquis called his attention to the disorder of his dress, and begged for a few minutes' conversation. The Count took him into his dressing room, and had him dressed from head to foot in his own clothes, whilst they talked. The Marquis then narrated a made-up story to M. de Saint Geran relative to the accusation brought against him. This greatly impressed his relative, and gave him a secure footing in the chateau. When he had finished dressing, he followed the Count, who presented him to the Countess and the rest of the family. It will now be in place to state who the inmates of the chateau were, and to relate some previous occurrences to explain subsequent ones. The Marshal de Saint Geran, of the illustrious house of Guiche, and governor of the Bourbonnais, had married, for his first wife, Anne de Tournon, by whom he had one son, Claude de la Guiche, and one daughter, who married the Marquis de Bull. His wife dying, he married again with Suzanne d'Epaules, who had also been previously married, being the widow of the Count de Longuenay, by whom she had Suzanne de Longuenay. The Marshal and his wife, Suzanne d'Epaules, for the mutual benefit of their children by first nuptials, determined to marry them, thus sealing their own union with a double tie. Claude de Guiche, the Marshal's son, married Suzanne de Longuenay. This alliance was much to the distaste of the Marchioness de Bull, the Marshal's daughter, who found herself separated from her stepmother, and married to a man who, it was said, gave her great cause for complaint, the greatest being his 80 years and 10. The contract of marriage between Claude de la Guiche and Suzanne de Longanet was executed at Rouen on the 17th of February, 1619, but the tender age of the bridegroom, who was then but 18, was the cause of his taking a tour in Italy, whence he returned after 2 years. The marriage was a very happy one, but for one circumstance it produced no issue. The Countess could not endure a barrenness which threatened the end of a great name, the extinction of a noble race. She made vows, pilgrimages, she consulted doctors and quacks, but to no purpose. The Marshal de Saint Geran died on the loath of December 1632, having the mortification of having seen no descending issue from the marriage of his son. The latter, now Count de Saint Geran, succeeded his father in the government of the Bourbonnais, and was named Chevalier of the King's Orders. Meanwhile, the Marchioness de Boll quarreled with her old husband the Marquis, separated from him after a scandalous divorce, and came to live at the Château of Saint Geran, quite at ease as to her brother's marriage, seeing that in default of heirs all his property would revert to her. Such was the state of affairs when the Marquis de Saint Geran arrived at the château. He was young, handsome, very cunning, and very successful with women. He even made a conquest of the Dowager Countess de Saint Geran, who lived there with her children. He soon plainly saw that he might easily enter into the most intimate relations with the Marchioness de Boll. The Marquis de Saint Geran's own fortune was much impaired by his extravagance and by the exactions of the law, or rather, in plain words, he had lost it all. The Marchioness was heiress presumptive to the Count. He calculated that she would soon lose her own husband. In any case, the life of a septuagenarian did not much trouble a man like the Marquis. He could then prevail upon the Marchioness to marry him, thus giving him the command of the finest fortune in the province. He set to work to pay his court to her, especially avoiding anything that could excite the slightest suspicion. It was, however, difficult to get on good terms with the Marchioness without showing outsiders what was going on. But the Marchioness, already prepossessed by the agreeable exterior of M. de Saint Geran, soon fell into his toils, and the unhappiness of her marriage, with the annoyances incidental to a scandalous case in the courts, left her powerless to resist his schemes. Nevertheless, they had but few opportunities of seeing one foot another alone. The Countess innocently took a part in all their conversations. The Count often came to take the Marquis out hunting. The days passed in family pursuits. M. de Saint Geran had not so far had an opportunity of saying what a discreet woman ought to pretend not to hear. This intrigue, notwithstanding the Marquis's impatience, dragged terribly. The Countess, as has been stated, had for 20 years never ceased to hope that her prayers would procure for her the grace of bearing a son to her husband. Out of sheer weariness she had given herself up to all kinds of charlatans, who at that period were well received by people of rank. On one occasion she brought from Italy a sort of astrologer, who as nearly as possible poisoned her with a horrible nostrum, and was sent back to his own country in a hurry, thanking his stars for having escaped so cheaply. This procured Madame de Saint Geran a severe reprimand from her confessor, and, as time went on, she gradually accustomed herself to the painful conclusion that she would die childless, and cast herself into the arms of religion. The Count, whose tenderness for her never failed, yet clung to the hope of an heir, and made his will with this in view. The Marchioness's hopes had become certainties, and M. de Saint Geran, perfectly tranquil on this head, thought only of forwarding his suit with Madame de Boll, when, at the end of the month of November 1640, the Count de Saint Geran was obliged to repair to Paris in great haste on pressing duty. The Countess, who could not bear to be separated from her husband, took the family advice as to accompanying him. The Marquis, delighted at an opportunity which left him almost alone in the château with Madame de Boll, painted the journey to Paris in the most attractive colors, and said all he could to decide her to go. The Marchioness, for her part, worked very quietly to the same end. It was more than was needed. It was settled that the Countess should go with M. de Saint Geran. She soon made her preparations, and a few days later they set off on the journey together. The Marquis had no fears about declaring his passion. The conquest of Madame de Boll gave him no trouble. He affected the most violent love, and she responded in the same terms. All their time was spent in excursions and walks from which the servants were excluded. the lovers, always together, passed whole days in some retired part of the park, or shut up in their apartments. It was impossible for these circumstances not to cause gossip among an army of servants, against whom they had to keep incessantly on their guard, and this naturally happened. The Marchioness soon found herself obliged to make confidants of the sisters Canet, her maids. She had no difficulty in gaining their support, for the girls were greatly attached to her. This was the first step of shame for Madame de Bull, and the first step of corruption for herself and her paramour, who soon found themselves entangled in the blackest of plots. Moreover, there was at the Château de Saint Geran a tall, spare, yellow, stupid man, just intelligent enough to perform, if not to conceive, a bad action, who was placed in authority over the domestics. He was a common peasant whom the old marshal had deigned to notice, and whom the count had by degrees promoted to the service of major domo on account of his long service in the house, and because he had seen him there since he himself was a child. He would not take him away as body servant, fearing that his notions of service would not do for Paris, and left him to the superintendence of the household. The Marquis had a quiet talk with this man, took his measure, warped his mind as he wished, gave him some money, and acquired him body and soul. These different agents undertook to stop the chatter of the servants' hall, and thenceforward the lovers could enjoy free intercourse. One evening, as the Marquis de Saint Geran was at supper in company with the Marchioness, a loud knocking was heard at the gate of the chateau, to which they paid no great attention. This was followed by the appearance of a courier who had come post-haste from Paris. He entered the courtyard with a letter from the Count de Saint Geran for the Marquis. He was announced and introduced, followed by nearly all the household. The Marquis asked the meaning of all this, and dismissed all the following with a wave of the hand, but the courier explained that the Count desired that the letter in his hands should be read before everyone. The Marquis opened it without replying, glanced over it, and read it out loud without the slightest alteration. The Count announced to his good relations and to all his household that the Countess had indicated positive symptoms of pregnancy, that hardly had she arrived in Paris when she suffered from fainting fits, nausea, retching, that she bore with joy these premonitory indications, which were no longer a matter of doubt to the physicians, nor to anyone, that for his part he was overwhelmed with joy at this event, which was the crowning stroke to all his wishes, that he desired the chateau to share his satisfaction by indulging in all kinds of gaieties, and that so far as other matters were concerned they could remain as they were till the return of himself and the Countess, which the letter would precede only a few days, as he was going to transport her in a litter for greater safety. Then followed the specification of certain sums of money to be distributed among the servants. The servants uttered cries of joy. The Marquis and Marchioness exchanged a look, but a very troublous one. They, however, restrained themselves so far as to simulate a great satisfaction, and the Marquis brought himself to congratulate the servants on their attachment to their master and mistress. After this they were left alone, looking very serious, while crackers exploded and violins resounded under the windows. For some time they preserved silence, the first thought which occurred to both being that the Count and Countess had allowed themselves to be deceived by trifling symptoms, that people had wished to flatter their hopes, that it was impossible for a constitution to change so suddenly after 20 years, and that it was a case of simulative pregnancy. This opinion gaining strength in their minds made them somewhat calmer. The next day they took a walk side by side in a solitary path in the park and discussed the chances of their situation. De Saint Geran brought before the Marchioness the enormous injury which this event would bring them. He then said that even supposing the news to be true, there were many rocks ahead to be weathered before the succession could be pronounced secure. "The child may die," he said at last. And he uttered some sinister expressions on the slight damage caused by the loss of a puny creature without mind, interest, or consequence. Nothing, he said, but a bit of ill-organized matter, which only came into the world to ruin so considerable a person as the Marchioness. "But what is the use of tormenting ourselves?" he went on impatiently. "The Countess is not pregnant, nor can she be." A gardener working near them overheard this part of the conversation, but as they walked away from him he could not hear any more. A few days later, some outriders, sent before him by the Count, entered the chateau, saying that their master and mistress were close at hand. In fact, They were promptly followed by brakes and traveling carriages, and at length the Countess's litter was descried, which M. de Saint Geran, on horseback, had never lost sight of during the journey. It was a triumphal reception. All the peasants had left their work, and filled the air with shouts of welcome. The servants ran to meet their mistress. The ancient retainers wept for joy at seeing the Count so happy and in the hope that his noble qualities might be perpetuated in his heir. The Marquis and Madame de Boll did their best to tune up to the pitch of this hilarity. The Dowager Countess, who had arrived at the chateau the same day, unable to convince herself as to this news, had the pleasure of satisfying herself respecting it. The Count and Countess were much beloved in the Bourbonnais province. This event caused therein a general satisfaction, particularly in the numerous houses attached to them by consanguinity. Within a few days of their return, more than 20 ladies of quality flocked to visit them in great haste, to show the great interest they took in this pregnancy. All these ladies, on one occasion or another, convinced themselves as to its genuineness, and many of them, carrying the subject still further, in a joking manner which pleased the Countess, dubbed themselves prophetesses, and predicted the birth of a boy. The usual symptoms incidental to the situation left no room for doubt. The country physicians were all agreed. The Count kept one of these physicians in the chateau for 2 months, and spoke to the Marquis of Saint Geran of his intention of procuring a good midwife, on the same terms. Finally, the Dowager Countess, who was to be sponsor, ordered at a great expense a magnificent store of baby linen, which she desired to present at the birth. The Marchioness devoured her rage, and among the persons who went beside themselves with joy not one remarked the disappointment which overspread her soul. Every day she saw the Marquis, who did all he could to increase her regret, and incessantly stirred up her ill humor by repeating that the Count and Countess were triumphing over her misfortune, and insinuating that they were importing a supposititious child to disinherit her. As usual both in private and political affairs, he began by corrupting the Marchioness's religious views, to pervert her into crime. The Marquis was one of those libertines so rare at that time, a period less unhappy than is generally believed, who made science dependent upon atheism. It is remarkable that great criminals of this epoch, Saint Croix for instance, and Exili, the gloomy poisoner, were the first unbelievers, and that they preceded the learned of the following age both, in philosophy and in the exclusive study of physical science, in which they included that of poisons. Passion, interest, hatred fought the Marquis's battles in the heart of Madame de Boll. She readily lent herself to everything that M. de Saint Geran wished. The Marquis de Saint Geran had a confidential servant, cunning, insolent, resourceful, whom he had brought from his estates, a servant well suited to such a master, whom he sent on errands frequently into the neighborhood of Saint Geran. One evening, as the Marquis was about to go to bed, this man, returning from one of his expeditions, entered his room, where he remained for a long time, telling him that he had at length found what he wanted, and giving him a small piece of paper which contained several names of places and persons. Next morning, at daybreak, the Marquis caused 2 of his horses to be saddled, pretended that he was summoned home on pressing business, foresaw that he should be absent for 3 or 4 days, made his excuses to the Count, and set off at full gallop, followed by his servant. They slept that night at an inn on the road to Auvergne, to put off the scent any persons who might recognize them. Then, following cross-country roads, they arrived after 2 days at a large hamlet, which they had seemed to have passed far to their left. In this hamlet was a woman who practiced the avocation of midwife, and was known as such in the neighborhood, but who had, it was said, mysterious and infamous secrets for those who paid her well. Further, she drew a good income from the influence which her art gave her over credulous people. It was all in her line to cure the king's evil, compound philters and love potions. She was useful in a variety of ways to girls who could afford to pay her. She was a lover's go-between, and even practiced sorcery for country folk. She played her cards so well, that the only persons privy to her misdeeds were unfortunate creatures who had as strong an interest as herself in keeping them profoundly secret, and as her terms were very high, she lived comfortably enough in a house her own property, and entirely alone, for greater security. In a general way, she was considered skillful in her ostensible profession, and was held in estimation by many persons of rank. This woman's name was Louise Goillard. Alone one evening after curfew, she heard a loud knocking at the door of her house. Accustomed to receive visits at all hours, she took her lamp without hesitation and opened the door. An armed man, apparently much agitated, entered the room. Louise Goillard, in a great fright, fell into a chair. This man was the Marquis de Saint Geran. "Calm yourself, good woman," said the stranger, panting and stammering. "Be calm, I beg, for it is I, not you, who have any cause for emotion. I am not a brigand, and far from your having anything to fear, it is I, on the contrary, who am come to beg for your assistance." He threw his cloak into a corner, unbuckled his waistbelt, and laid aside his sword. Then, falling into a chair, he said, "First of all, let me rest a little." The Marquis wore a traveling dress, but although he had not stated his name, Louise Goillard saw at a glance that he was a very different person from what she had thought, and that, on the contrary, he was some fine gentleman who had come on his love affairs. "I beg you to excuse," said she, "a fear which is insulting to you. You came in so hurriedly that I had not time to see whom I was talking to. My house is rather lonely, I am alone. Ill-disposed people might easily take advantage of these circumstances to plunder a poor woman who has little enough to lose. The times are so bad. You seem tired. Will you inhale some essence? Give me only a glass of water." Louise Goillard went into the adjoining room, and returned with an ewer. The Marquis affected to rinse his lips, and said, "I come from a great distance on a most important matter. Be assured that I shall be properly grateful for your services." He felt in his pocket, and pulled out a purse, which he rolled between his fingers. "In the first place, you must swear to the greatest secrecy." "There is no need of that with us," said Louise Goillard. "That is the first condition of our craft. I must have more express guarantees, and your oath that you will reveal to no one in the world what I am going to confide to you." "I give you my word, then, since you demand it, but I repeat that this is superfluous. You do not know me. Consider that this is a most serious matter, that I am as it were placing my head in your hands, and that I would lose my life 1,000 times rather than see this mystery unraveled." "Consider also," bluntly replied the midwife, "that we ourselves are primarily interested in all the secrets entrusted to us, that an indiscretion would destroy all confidence in us, and that there are even cases you may speak." When the Marquis had reassured her as to himself by this preface, he continued, "I know that you are a very able woman. I could indeed wish to be one, to serve you. That you have pushed the study of your art to its utmost limits. I fear they have been flattering your humble servant. And that your studies have enabled you to predict the future. That is all nonsense. It is true, I have been told so. You have been imposed upon. What is the use of denying it and refusing to do me a service?" Louise Goillard defended herself long. She could not understand a man of this quality believing in fortune-telling, which she practiced only with low-class people and rich farmers, but the Marquis appeared so earnest that she knew not what to think. "Listen," said he, "it is no use dissembling with me, I know all. Be easy, we are playing a game in which you are laying 1 against 1,000, moreover, here is something on account to compensate you for the trouble I am giving." He laid a pile of gold on the table. The matron weakly owned that she had sometimes attempted astrological combinations which were not always fortunate, and that she had been only induced to do so by the fascination of the phenomena of science. The secret of her guilty practices was drawn from her at the very outset of her defense. "That being so," replied the Marquis, "you must be already aware of the situation in which I find myself, you must know that, hurried away by a blind and ardent passion, I have betrayed the confidence of an old lady and violated the laws of hospitality by seducing her daughter in her own house, that matters have come to a crisis, and that this noble damsel, whom I love to distraction, being pregnant, is on the point of losing her life and honor by the discovery of her fault, which is mine." The matron replied that nothing could be ascertained about a person except from private questions, and to further impose upon the Marquis, she fetched a kind of box marked with figures and strange emblems. Opening this, and putting together certain figures which it contained, she declared that what the Marquis had told her was true, and that his situation was a most melancholy one. She added, in order to frighten him, that he was threatened by still more serious misfortunes than those which had already overtaken him, but that it was easy to anticipate and obviate these mischances by new consultations. "Madam," replied the Marquis, "I fear only one thing in the world, the dishonor of the woman I love." "Is there no method of remedying the usual embarrassment of a birth?" "I know of none," said the matron. "The young lady has succeeded in concealing her condition. It would be easy for her confinement to take place privately. She has already risked her life, and I cannot consent to be mixed up in this affair, for fear of the consequences." "Could not, for instance," said the Marquis, "a confinement be effected without pain?" "I don't know about that, but this I do know, that I shall take very good care not to practice any method contrary to the laws of nature." "You are deceiving me, you are acquainted with this method, you have already practiced it upon a certain person whom I could name to you." "Who has dared to calumniate me thus?" "I operate only after the decision of the faculty. God forbid that I should be stoned by all the physicians, and perhaps expelled from France." "Will you then let me die of despair?" "If I were capable of making a bad use of your secrets, I could have done so long ago, for I know them. In heaven's name, do not dissimulate any longer, and tell me how it is possible to stifle the pangs of labor." "Do you want more gold? Here it is." And he threw more louis on the table. "Stay," said the matron, "there is perhaps a method which I think I have discovered, and which I have never employed, but I believe it efficacious." "But if you have never employed it, it may be dangerous, and risk the life of the lady whom I love." "When I say never, I mean that I have tried it once, and most successfully." "Be at your ease." "Ah," cried the Marquis, "you have earned my everlasting gratitude. But," continued he, "if we could anticipate the confinement itself, and remove from henceforth the symptoms of pregnancy?" "Oh, sir, that is a great crime you speak of." "Alas," continued the Marquis, as if speaking to himself in a fit of intense grief, "I had rather lose a dear child, the pledge of our love, than bring into the world an unhappy creature which might possibly cause its mother's death. I pray you, sir, let no more be said on the subject. It is a horrible crime even to think of such a thing." "But what is to be done? Is it better to destroy two persons and perhaps kill a whole family with despair? Oh, madam, I entreat you, extricate us from this extremity." The Marquis buried his face in his hands, and sobbed as though he were weeping copiously. "Your despair grievously affects me," said the matron, "but consider that for a woman of my calling it is a capital offense." "What are you talking about? Do not our mystery, our safety, and our credit come in first?" "They can never get at you till after the death and dishonor of all that is dear to me in the world." "I might then, perhaps. But in this case you must insure me against legal complications, fines, and procure me a safe exit from the kingdom." "Ah! That is my affair. Take my whole fortune. Take my life." And he threw the whole purse on the table. In this case, and solely to extricate you from the extreme danger in which I see you placed, I consent to give you a decoction, and certain instructions, which will instantly relieve the lady from her burden. She must use the greatest precaution, and study to carry out exactly what I am about to tell you. My God! Only such desperate occasions as this one could induce me to hear. She took a flask from the bottom of a cupboard, and continued. Here is a liquor which never fails. Oh, madam, you save my honor, which is dearer to me than life. But this is not enough. Tell me what use I am to make of this liquor, and in what doses I am to administer it. The patient, replied the midwife, must take 1 spoonful the first day, the second day 2, the third. You will obey me to the minutest particular? I swear it. Let us start, then. She asked but for time to pack a little linen, put things in order, then fastened her doors, and left the house with the Marquis. A quarter of an hour later they were galloping through the night, without her knowing where the Marquis was taking her. The Marquis reappeared 3 days later at the chateau, finding the Count's family as he had left them, that is to say, intoxicated with hope, and counting the weeks, days, and hours before the accouchement of the Countess. He excused his hurried departure on the ground of the importance of the business which had summoned him away, and speaking of his journey at table, he related a story current in the country whence he came, of a surprising event which he had all but witnessed. It was the case of a lady of quality who suddenly found herself in the most dangerous pangs of labor. All the skill of the physicians who had been summoned proved futile. The lady was at the point of death. At last, in sheer despair, they summoned a midwife of great repute among the peasantry, but whose practice did not include the gentry. From the first treatment of this woman, who appeared modest and diffident to a degree, the pain ceased as if by enchantment, the patient fell into an indefinable calm languor, and after some hours was delivered of a beautiful infant, but after this was attacked by a violent fever which brought her to death's door. They then again had recourse to the doctors, notwithstanding the opposition of the master of the house, who had confidence in the matron. The doctor's treatment only made matters worse. In this extremity they again called in the midwife, and at the end of 3 weeks the lady was miraculously restored to life, thus, added the Marquis, establishing the reputation of the matron, who had sprung into such vogue in the town where she lived and the neighboring country that nothing else was talked about. This story made a great impression on the company. On account of the condition of the Countess, the dowager added that it was very wrong to ridicule these humble country experts, who often through observation and experience discovered secrets which proud doctors were unable to unravel with all their studies. Hereupon the Count cried out that this midwife must be sent for, as she was just the kind of woman they wanted. After this other matters were talked about, the Marquis changing the conversation, he had gained his point in quietly introducing the thin end of the wedge of his design. After dinner, the company walked on the terrace. The Countess Dowager not being able to walk much on account of her advanced age, the Countess and Madame de Bull took chairs beside her. The Count walked up and down with M. de Saint Maxent. The Marquis naturally asked how things had been going on during his absence, and if Madame de Saint Geran had suffered any inconvenience, for her pregnancy had become the most important affair in the household, and hardly anything else was talked about. By the way, said the Count, you were speaking just now of a very skillful midwife. Would it not be a good step to summon her? I think, replied the Marquis, that it would be an excellent selection, for I do not suppose there is one in this neighborhood to compare to her. I have a great mind to send for her at once, and to keep her about the Countess, whose constitution she will be all the better acquainted with if she studies it beforehand. Do you know where I can send for her? Faith, said the Marquis, she lives in a village, but I don't know which. But at least you know her name? I can hardly remember it. Louise Boyard, I think, or Polliard, one or the other. How? Have you not even retained the name? I heard the story, that's all. Who the deuce can keep a name in his head which he hears in such a chance fashion? But did the condition of the Countess never occur to you? It was so far away that I did not suppose you would send such a distance. I thought you were already provided. How can we set about to find her? If that is all, I have a servant who knows people in that part of the country, and who knows how to go about things. If you like, he shall go in quest of her. If I like? This very moment. The same evening the servant started on his errand with the Count's instructions, not forgetting those of his master. He went at full speed. It may readily be supposed that he had not far to seek the woman he was to bring back with him, but he purposely kept away for 3 days, and at the end of this time Louise Goillard was installed in the chateau. She was a woman of plain and severe exterior, who at once inspired confidence in everyone. The plots of the Marquis and Madame de Bull thus throve with most baneful success, but an accident happened which threatened to nullify them, and, by causing a great disaster, to prevent a crime. The Countess, passing into her apartments, caught her foot in a carpet, and fell heavily on the floor. At the cries of a footman all the household was astir. The Countess was carried to bed, the most intense alarm prevailed, but no bad consequences followed this accident, which produced only a further succession of visits from the neighboring gentry. This happened about the end of the 7th month. At length the moment of accouchement came. Everything had long before been arranged for the delivery, and nothing remained to be done. The Marquis had employed all this time in strengthening Madame de Bull against her scruples. He often saw Louise Goillard in private, and gave her his instructions, but he perceived that the corruption of Beaulieu, the house steward, was an essential factor. Beaulieu was already half gained over by the interviews of the year preceding. A large sum of ready money and many promises did the rest. This wretch was not ashamed to join a plot against a master to whom he owed everything. The Marchioness, for her part, and always under the instigation of M. de Saint Geran, secured matters all round by bringing into the abominable plot the Canet girls, her maids, so that there was nothing but treason and conspiracy against this worthy family among their upper servants, usually styled confidential. Thus, having prepared matters, the conspirators awaited the event. On the 16th of August the Countess de Saint Geran was overtaken by the pangs of labor in the chapel of the chateau, where she was hearing Mass. They carried her to her room before Mass was over, her women ran around her, and the Countess Dowager with her own hands arranged on her head a cap of the pattern worn by ladies about to be confined, a cap which is not usually removed till some time later. The pains recurred with terrible intensity. The Count wept at his wife's cries. Many persons were present. The Dowager's 2 daughters by her second marriage, one of whom, then 16 years of age, afterwards married the Duc de Ventadour and was a party to the lawsuit, wished to be present at this accouchement, which was to perpetuate by a new scion an illustrious race near extinction. There were also Dame Saligny, sister of the late Marshal Saint Geran, the Marquis de Saint Geran, and the Marchioness de Bull. Everything seemed to favor the projects of these last 2 persons, who took an interest in the event of a very different character from that generally felt. As the pains produced no result, and the accouchement was of the most difficult nature, while the Countess was near the last extremity, expresses were sent to all the neighboring parishes to offer prayers for the mother and the child. The Holy Sacrament was elevated in the churches at Moulins. The midwife attended to everything herself. She maintained that the Countess would be more comfortable if her slightest desires were instantly complied with. The Countess herself never spoke a word, only interrupting the gloomy silence by heart-rending cries. All at once, Madame de Bull, who affected to be bustling about, pointed out that the presence of so many persons was what hindered the Countess's accouchement, and, assuming an air of authority justified by fictitious tenderness, said that everyone must retire, leaving the patient in the hands of the persons who were absolutely necessary to her, and that, to remove any possible objections, the Countess Dowager her mother must set the example. The opportunity was made use of to remove the Count from this harrowing spectacle, and everyone followed the Countess Dowager. Even the Countess's own maids were not allowed to remain, being sent on errands which kept them out of the way. This further reason was given, that the eldest being scarcely 15, they were too young to be present on such an occasion. The only persons remaining by the bedside were the Marchioness de Bull, the midwife, and the 2 Canet girls. The Countess was thus in the hands of her most cruel enemies. It was 7 o'clock in the evening, the labors continued, the elder Canet girl held the patient by the hand to soothe her. The Count and the Dowager sent incessantly to know the news. They were told that everything was going on well, and that shortly their wishes would be accomplished, but none of the servants were allowed to enter the room. 3 hours later, the midwife declared that the Countess could not hold out any longer unless she got some rest. She made her swallow a liquor which was introduced into her mouth by spoonfuls. The Countess fell into so deep a sleep that she seemed to be dead. The younger Canet girl thought for a moment that they had killed her, and wept in a corner of the room, till Madame de Bull reassured her. During this frightful night a shadowy figure prowled in the corridors, silently patrolled the rooms, and came now and then to the door of the bedroom, where he conferred in a low tone with the midwife and the Marchioness de Bull. This was the Marquis de Saint Geran, who gave his orders, encouraged his people, watched over every point of his plot, himself a prey to the agonies of nervousness which accompany the preparations for a great crime. The Dowager Countess, owing to her great age, had been compelled to take some rest. The Count sat up, worn out with fatigue, in a downstairs room hard by that in which they were compassing the ruin of all most dear to him in the world. The Countess, in her profound lethargy, gave birth, without being aware of it, to a boy, who thus fell on his entry into the world into the hands of his enemies, his mother powerless to defend him by her cries and tears. The door was half opened, and a man who was waiting outside brought in. This was the Major Domo Baliu. The midwife, pretending to afford the first necessary cares to the child, had taken it into a corner. Baliu watched her movements, and springing upon her, pinioned her arms. The wretched woman dug her nails into the child's head. He snatched it from her, but the poor infant for long bore the marks of her claws. Possibly the Marchioness de Bull could not nerve herself to the commission of so great a crime, but it seems more probable that the steward prevented the destruction of the child under the orders of M. de Saint Geran. The theory is that the Marquis, mistrustful of the promise made him by Madame de Bull to marry him after the death of her husband, desired to keep the child to oblige her to keep her word, under threats of getting him acknowledged, if she proved faithless to him. No other adequate reason can be conjectured to determine a man of his character to take such great care of his victim. Baliu swaddled the child immediately, put it in a basket, hid it under his cloak, and went with his prey to find the Marquis. They conferred together for some time, after which the house steward passed by a postern gate into the moat, thence to a terrace by which he reached a bridge leading into the park. This park had 12 gates, and he had the keys of all. He mounted a blood horse which he had left waiting behind a wall, and started off at full gallop. The same day he passed through the village of Esterels, a league distant from Saint Geran, where he stopped at the house of a nurse, wife of a glovemaker named Claude. This peasant woman gave her breast to the child, but the steward, not daring to stay in a village so near Saint Geran, crossed the river Allier at the Porte de la Chaise, and calling at the house of a man named Bocade, the good wife suckled the child for the second time. He then continued his journey in the direction of Auvergne. The heat was excessive, his horse was done up, the child seemed uneasy. A carrier's cart passed him going to Riom. It was owned by a certain Paul Boythian of the town of Aigueperce, a common carrier on the road. Baliu went alongside to put the child in the cart, which he entered himself, carrying the infant on his knees. The horse followed, fastened by the bridle to the back of the cart. In the conversation which he held with this man, Baliu said that he should not take so much care of the child did it not belong to the most noble house in the Bourbonnais. They reached the village of Che at midday. The mistress of the house where he put up, who was nursing an infant, consented to give some of her milk to the child. The poor creature was covered with blood. She warmed some water, stripped off its swaddling linen, washed it from head to foot, and swathed it up again more neatly. The carrier then took them to Rheims. When they got there, Beaulieu got rid of him by giving a false meeting place for their departure, left in the direction of the Abbey of Lavogne, and reached the village of Descoutu, in the mountains, between Lavogne and Thiers. The Marchioness de Bull had a chateau there where she occasionally spent some time. The child was nursed at Descoutu by Gabrielle Moyny, who was paid a month in advance, but she only kept it a week or so, because they refused to tell her the father and mother and to refer her to a place where she might send reports of her charge. This woman having made these reasons public, no nurse could be found to take charge of the child, which was removed from the village of Descoutu. The persons who removed it took the highroad to Burgundy, crossing a densely wooded country, and here they lost their way. The above particulars were subsequently proved by the nurses, the carrier, and others who made legal depositions. They are stated at length here, as they proved very important in the great lawsuit. The compilers of the case, into which we search for information, have however omitted to tell us how the absence of the major domo was accounted for at the castle. Probably the far-sighted Marquis had got an excuse ready. The Countess's state of drowsiness continued till daybreak. She woke bathed in blood, completely exhausted, but yet with a sensation of comfort which convinced her that she had been delivered from her burden. Her first words were about her child. She wished to see it, kiss it. She asked where it was. The midwife coolly told her, whilst the girls who were by were filled with amazement at her audacity, that she had not been confined at all. The Countess maintained the contrary, and as she grew very excited, the midwife strove to calm her, assuring her that in any case her delivery could not be long protracted, and that, judging from all the indications of the night, she would give birth to a boy. This promise comforted the Count and the Countess Dowager, but failed to satisfy the Countess, who insisted that a child had been born. The same day a scullery maid met a woman going to the water's edge in the castle moat, with a parcel in her arms. She recognized the midwife, and asked what she was carrying and where she was going so early. The latter replied that she was very inquisitive, and that it was nothing at all, but the girl, laughingly pretending to be angry at this answer, pulled open one of the ends of the parcel before the midwife had time to stop her, and exposed to view some linen soaked in blood. "Madame has been confined, then," she said to the matron. "No," replied she briskly, "she has not." The girl was unconvinced, and said, "How do you mean that she has not, when Madame the Marchioness, who was there, says she has?" The matron in great confusion replied, "She must have a very long tongue, if she said so." The girl's evidence was later found most important. The Countess's uneasiness made her worse the next day. She implored with sighs and tears at least to be told what had become of her child, steadily maintaining that she was not mistaken when she assured them that she had given birth to one. The midwife with great effrontery told her that the new moon was unfavorable to childbirth, and that she must wait for the wane, when it would be easier as matters were already prepared. Invalids' fancies do not obtain much credence. Still, the persistence of the Countess would have convinced everyone in the long run, had not the Dowager said that she remembered at the end of the 9th month of one of her own pregnancies she had all the premonitory symptoms of lying in, but they proved false, and in fact the accouchement took place 3 months later. This piece of news inspired great confidence. The Marquis and Madame de Bull did all in their power to confirm it, but the Countess obstinately refused to listen to it, and her passionate transports of grief gave rise to the greatest anxiety. The midwife, who knew not how to gain time, and was losing all hope in face of the Countess's persistence, was almost frightened out of her wits. She entered into medical details, and finally said that some violent exercise must be taken to induce labor. The Countess, still unconvinced, refused to obey this order, but the Count, the Dowager, and all the family entreated her so earnestly that she gave way.